I spent 35 years exposing financial predators, but nothing prepared me for the moment my own son sat across a courtroom trying to convince a judge that I was mentally unfit. While his wife smirked beside him and whispered that I would leave with nothing, they had no idea I already knew about the forged documents, the drugged medication, and the secret plan to erase me from my own life. They thought grief had made me weak. They thought age had made me helpless. But the biggest mistake they ever made was forgetting who I used to be. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so do not hold back. And if you are new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you will always be the first to catch our latest tales. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Vivian Holloway, and at 68 years old, I believed I had already survived the hardest battle of my life. I was wrong. 3 weeks after my husband Richard died, silence became the loudest thing inside my house. The old mansion overlooking the Savannah River had once felt warm, alive, and permanent. Richard filled every hallway with his calm presence, his low laughter, and the faint scent of cedarwood cologne that lingered on his jackets long after he left a room. After 42 years of marriage, I had grown so accustomed to his existence that the absence of it felt unnatural, almost violent. Now every room echoed. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked like a heartbeat in a funeral chapel. The crystal glasses inside the dining cabinet remained untouched. Dust settled slowly across Richard's reading chair beside the tall bay window where he used to spend entire afternoons with history books resting on his lap. Savannah itself seemed to mourn with me. Heavy coastal air drifted through the oak trees outside the property, carrying the distant sound of riverboats moving across the dark water. Tourists still wandered through the historic district each evening, smiling beneath glowing lanterns, but my world had narrowed into grief, medication bottles, and sleepless nights. For most of my life, weakness had been something I recognized in other people, never in myself. I spent more than 3 decades working as a federal financial investigator, specializing in interstate fraud and money laundering. I'd interrogated corrupt executives, dismantled criminal networks, and testified in courtrooms from Georgia to New York. Men with private jets and million-dollar lawyers once trembled when my name appeared in federal reports. Back then, people listened when I spoke. Back then, nobody mistook me for fragile. But grief changes a person in ways pride refuses to admit. After Richard's funeral, my son Nathan began visiting almost every day. At first, I welcomed it. He was my only child, tall and polished like his father, carrying himself with the same smooth confidence that once made judges admire him inside a courtroom. Nathan had built a successful career in real estate law before everything in the market began collapsing around him. His wife, Lindsay Carter, always arrived beside him looking immaculate and composed. She wore soft, neutral colors, expensive perfume, and the kind of smile that never fully reached her eyes. She moved through my home too comfortably. Within days, she reorganized my kitchen cabinets without asking. She labeled pantry containers, changed the arrangement of my medicine drawer, and replaced fresh flowers in the dining room as though she already belonged there. Nathan began discussing my finances casually over dinner: retirement accounts, property taxes, maintenance costs on the house. At first, I assumed he was worried about me. Then I started noticing Lindsay studying things, not admiring them, studying them. The antique silver collection, Richard's vintage watches, the oil paintings hanging along the staircase, the locked filing cabinet inside my office. She observed everything with quiet calculation. One rainy evening, Nathan placed a stack of legal papers across the dining table while thunder rolled above the river outside. He described them as simple protection documents, temporary safeguards in case something happened to me. I remember staring at those pages while a strange heaviness settled inside my chest. Every instinct I had sharpened over 35 years whispered that something felt wrong. But Richard was gone. I was tired. And Nathan was my son. So despite every warning inside me, I picked up the pen and signed. The changes began so gradually that, at first, I convinced myself they were natural. Grief could explain exhaustion. Age could explain forgetfulness. Sleepless nights could explain why my thoughts sometimes drifted in strange directions before disappearing entirely. At least that was what I kept telling myself. A week after signing the documents Nathan placed before me, my mornings became difficult. I woke with a heavy fog pressing behind my eyes. Some afternoons, I would sit in the sunroom overlooking the Savannah River and suddenly realize an entire hour had disappeared without memory of what I had been thinking about. My body no longer felt reliable. The humid Georgia heat seemed thicker than usual that summer. Thunderstorms rolled over Savannah almost every evening, darkening the sky by late afternoon and filling the old mansion with low, trembling sounds that made the walls creak at night. Meanwhile, Lindsay quietly tightened her control over the house. She answered phone calls before I could reach them. She insisted on organizing my medication herself. She replaced my longtime pharmacist with one she claimed was more efficient. Even grocery deliveries now arrived, according to lists I never remembered approving. Nathan constantly repeated small observations that slowly poisoned the atmosphere around me. I forgot where I left my glasses one morning, and he exchanged a look with Lindsay that lasted barely 2 seconds too long. Another afternoon, I misplaced my reading notebook, and Nathan gently suggested that maybe I should stop driving for a while until I felt stronger emotionally. Each incident sounded harmless on its own. Together, they began forming a frightening picture. For the first time in my life, I started wondering whether my mind was betraying me. Then came Dr. Howard Bellamy. Nathan introduced him as a specialist who performed routine cognitive evaluations for seniors coping with grief. The man arrived during a rainy afternoon carrying an expensive leather briefcase and the detached expression of someone already bored before beginning his work. Something about him unsettled me immediately. He asked simplistic questions without waiting for full answers. He barely looked at me while taking notes. Several times, I noticed him glancing toward Lindsay as though checking for approval. The entire evaluation lasted less than 30 minutes. By the end, Bellamy folded his hands and informed me that I showed signs of early cognitive decline, complicated by emotional trauma after losing my husband. I remember feeling humiliated more than angry, not because I believed him completely, but because part of me feared he might be right. That same evening, Lindsay began using the diagnosis as justification for everything. She offered to supervise my finances temporarily. Nathan volunteered to handle property taxes and investments. My car keys quietly disappeared from the kitchen drawer the next morning. The isolation worsened quickly after that. Neighbors who once treated me normally now looked at me with cautious sympathy. I noticed Lindsay speaking privately with several women from the neighborhood association near the front gate one afternoon. Afterward, their smiles toward me carried the uncomfortable softness people reserve for the fragile or unstable. Inside the house, things began moving. Financial folders inside my office appeared slightly disturbed. Cabinets no longer stayed organized the way I preferred. One evening, I found Richard's private lockbox sitting half an inch out of place inside the study bookshelf. Someone had searched through it. Then came the night everything changed. I woke sometime after midnight feeling dizzy and strangely dehydrated. The mansion was dark except for faint light spilling from the downstairs dining room. As I moved quietly toward the staircase, I heard voices below. Nathan sounded tense. Lindsay sounded cold. They discussed conservatorship papers, private care facilities, and selling the mansion quickly before property values shifted again. Then Lindsay said something that froze me completely in the darkness beside the stairs. "We need to finish this before she changes the will." In that moment, grief disappeared. The fog inside my head suddenly cleared with terrifying sharpness. After 35 years investigating financial predators, I recognized the sound of a planned operation unfolding. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized I was not simply a grieving widow. I was a target. That night, after overhearing Nathan and Lindsay downstairs, I returned to my bedroom without making a sound. I closed the door softly behind me and stood motionless in the darkness while rain battered the tall windows overlooking the Savannah River. My heart pounded so violently I could feel it inside my throat, but beneath the fear, something colder had begun to emerge. Clarity. For weeks, grief had wrapped around my mind like heavy fog. Now, for the first time since Richard died, I could think again. I sat on the edge of my bed and forced myself to breathe slowly. During 35 years as a federal financial investigator, I learned one important truth about predators. The most dangerous ones never relied on force first. They relied on confusion, emotional weakness, and trust. They slowly reshaped reality around their victims until surrender felt reasonable. Suddenly, every strange moment inside the house began connecting together with terrifying precision. The pills, the memory comments, the fake concern, the legal documents, the doctor, none of it had been random. I understood then that grief had made me vulnerable enough to ignore instincts that once protected me professionally for decades. The next morning, I began watching them carefully. I paid attention to routines, expressions, and whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. Lindsay monitored my medication schedule obsessively, always standing nearby while I swallowed the pills she handed me every evening with herbal tea. So I stopped taking them. The first night, I hid the tablet beneath my tongue until she left the room. Then I wrapped it in tissue paper and flushed it down the bathroom toilet. I repeated the process the following day. Then the day after that. Within 72 hours, the changes inside my body became undeniable. The dizziness weakened first. The constant heaviness behind my eyes began disappearing. My thoughts sharpened. I could suddenly remember small details again without struggling. I was not losing my mind. Someone had been making me appear that way. Outside, Savannah remained trapped beneath suffocating summer heat. Thunderstorms rolled through almost every evening, leaving the mansion heavy with the damp air and the scent of wet oak trees drifting through old window frames. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere had changed even more dramatically. I no longer felt like a grieving widow. I felt like an investigator inside hostile territory. Quietly, I began rebuilding mental timelines the same way I once did during federal investigations. I memorized conversations, tracked movements, and checked financial records whenever Nathan and Lindsay left the house. The evidence appeared faster than I expected. Several retirement accounts showed unusual access attempts. I discovered inquiries regarding property-backed loans connected to the mansion. There were digital authorization requests I never approved. Nathan had entered accounts he should never have touched. Even worse, someone had initiated preliminary discussions with a private lender using my property as collateral. The realization hollowed something deep inside my chest. This was not temporary desperation. This was organized theft. One humid afternoon, I pretended to fall asleep in the library while Lindsay sat nearby speaking softly on her phone. Through partially closed eyes, I watched her pacing slowly near the fireplace. She mentioned a luxury real estate broker, then a buyer from New York, then a timeline. After she left, I waited almost an hour before climbing quietly into the attic office Richard once used for tax records. Hidden beneath old storage boxes sat a laptop I had not touched in years. I spent nearly 3 hours searching property databases and archived transaction systems. What I found made my blood run cold. Nathan and Lindsay had already signed a preliminary agreement to sell the mansion before any conservatorship hearing even existed. A private investor had deposited $180,000 into an escrow account connected to the transaction. Attached to the documents was a digital authorization carrying my forged approval. I stared at the screen while thunder rolled outside across the dark river. This had been planned for months, not weeks, months. Later that night, I sat alone in Richard's old study holding a faded photograph of Nathan at 8 years old, smiling beside the fishing dock behind our house. That child no longer existed. The man living under my roof was not trying to help me anymore. He was preparing to erase me. Once I accepted that Nathan and Lindsay were deliberately building a legal trap around me, fear slowly gave way to something colder and far more useful: discipline. I understood immediately that confronting them too early would be fatal. People willing to forge documents, manipulate medication, and secretly sell a woman's home before declaring her incompetent would not panic easily. They would simply adapt. I needed evidence strong enough to survive a courtroom, so I reached out to the only person left in Savannah I trusted completely. Judge Amelia Brooks had retired 3 years before I did. During our careers, we worked several major financial crime cases together across Georgia. Amelia possessed the kind of mind that noticed weakness in an argument before most lawyers finished speaking. When I finally called her from a prepaid phone purchased quietly at a pharmacy downtown, she recognized tension in my voice immediately. We met 2 days later inside a quiet riverside cafe far from my neighborhood. Amelia listened without interrupting while I explained everything: Nathan, Lindsay, the medication, the forged property authorization, the conservatorship discussions. By the time I finished, her face had hardened with controlled fury. She told me elder conservatorship fraud had become increasingly common throughout Georgia during the last decade. Wealthy seniors were being isolated, drugged, manipulated, and legally stripped of assets through carefully staged competency claims. For the first time since Richard died, another professional looked at me not as a grieving widow, but as a credible witness. That mattered more than I expected. Using contacts Amelia still trusted inside private forensic networks, I arranged independent toxicology testing on the pills Lindsay gave me every night. I secretly stored several tablets inside an old sewing kit hidden beneath winter blankets in the attic. The results arrived 4 days later. Heavy benzodiazepine compounds, high enough dosages to create confusion, impaired memory, emotional instability, and long-term cognitive fog. I sat alone in my parked car near Forsyth Park reading the report while summer heat pressed against the windshield like a living thing. Every doubt disappeared in that moment. They had been poisoning me deliberately. My anger became clean after that, focused. I also began investigating Dr. Howard Bellamy more thoroughly. Amelia quietly pulled archived legal complaints through old judicial contacts. Bellamy's history was worse than I imagined. Multiple accusations involving questionable competency evaluations, connections to disputed guardianship cases, families claiming elderly relatives lost property shortly after his assessments. Yet somehow, he continued practicing. The system itself had become part of the weapon used against vulnerable people. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Nathan grew increasingly impatient. He arrived with new paperwork almost daily, discussions about estate planning, medical authorizations, financial restructuring. His tone remained gentle, but pressure now lived beneath every conversation. Lindsay's mask slipped more frequently too. I caught flashes of irritation whenever I asked simple questions twice intentionally. Sometimes I pretended confusion on purpose, repeating dates incorrectly or misplacing harmless objects where she could easily notice them. The more fragile I appeared, the more careless they became. One humid night near midnight, I heard movement downstairs after Nathan had gone to bed. Through the partially open guest room door, I watched Lindsay kneel beside the closet and unlock a small hidden safe behind stacked luggage. After she returned upstairs, I waited 20 minutes before entering quietly. Inside the safe sat folders containing forged signatures, offshore banking paperwork, encrypted account references, and draft death certificate forms partially completed but missing dates. Then I found something that nearly stopped my heart. A $3 million life insurance policy purchased in my name 6 weeks earlier. Primary beneficiary, Nathan Holloway. Beneath it rested preliminary paperwork from a funeral home outside Savannah. My hands trembled as I photographed every document with the hidden phone Amelia had given me. This was no longer about stealing property. They were preparing for my death financially before it even happened. Later that night, I stood alone before the bathroom mirror staring at my own reflection. For the first time in weeks, I recognized the woman looking back at me. Nathan and Lindsay had made one catastrophic mistake. They targeted someone who spent her entire life hunting predators exactly like them. The morning of the conservatorship hearing arrived wrapped in heavy gray clouds, hanging low above Savannah. I stood inside my bedroom staring at my reflection while fastening the pearl earrings Richard gave me on our 30th wedding anniversary. They were simple, elegant, and impossibly precious to me now. I chose a dark navy suit tailored years earlier for federal testimony in Washington because I needed to remember exactly who I had once been. Not a widow, not a victim. A woman who survived courtrooms filled with dangerous men. Downstairs, the mansion felt unusually silent as I walked toward the front entrance. Nathan and Lindsay were already waiting near the driveway beside Nathan's silver sedan. Lindsay wore cream-colored designer clothing that projected sympathy so perfectly it almost looked theatrical. Nathan barely met my eyes. The old courthouse in downtown Savannah carried the same atmosphere I remembered from decades earlier. Polished wooden benches, marble floors worn smooth by generations of legal battles. Reporters clustered quietly near the entrance after hearing rumors involving a wealthy widow and disputed competency claims. I arrived alone intentionally. I wanted Nathan and Lindsay to believe their strategy had worked completely. Inside the courtroom, Lindsay leaned close to Nathan while pretending not to look at me. Her expression carried cold satisfaction. Then I heard her whisper softly enough about it that only I could catch the words. She will leave with nothing. The sentence should have broken me. Instead, it settled something inside me permanently. I took my seat calmly at the defense table while Nathan's attorney organized thick folders filled with fabricated concern and legal manipulation disguised as protection. The courtroom doors opened moments later. Judge Daniel Mercer entered. Everything changed instantly. He stopped midway toward the bench after seeing me seated there. For one brief moment, genuine shock crossed his face. 20 years earlier, Daniel Mercer had worked beside me during one of the largest federal corruption investigations in Georgia history. Back then, he was a young assistant prosecutor desperate to prove himself. I personally trained him during the case that eventually destroyed 3 public officials connected to interstate laundering operations. Now he stared at me as though seeing a ghost from another life. "Mrs. Holloway," he said slowly before sitting down. Nathan looked confused immediately. Lindsay's confidence faltered for the first time all morning. The hearing began with Nathan's attorney presenting the same carefully constructed narrative I had expected for weeks. Grieving widow, emotional instability, Progressive cognitive decline. Loving son attempting to protect vulnerable mother from financial confusion. I listened without reacting. Judge Mercer occasionally glanced toward me while reviewing Dr. Bellamy's evaluation report. The longer he read, the more skeptical his expression became. Then he asked me several ordinary questions. Today's date, my address, the purpose of the hearing. I answered each one clearly and without hesitation. The courtroom atmosphere shifted slowly after that. Mercer asked additional questions connected to legal procedure, financial authorization standards, and memory retention. I responded instinctively, the same way I had answered judges and federal investigators throughout my career. Nathan's posture tightened visibly beside his attorney. Lindsay attempted emotional performance next. She described my supposed confusion, my forgetfulness, and my inability to manage daily responsibilities safely. Her voice trembled in exactly the places she intended, but she made one critical mistake. She underestimated how closely judges observe behavior. Mercer watched her far more carefully than she realized. Meanwhile, I remained calm. That calmness cost me more emotionally than anyone inside the courtroom understood. Across the room sat my only child, arguing for legal control over my life, while strangers discussed my mind as though I were already disappearing. Part of me still wanted Nathan to stand up and stop everything. He never did. Finally, Mercer placed Bellamy's report down slowly on the bench. "Mrs. Holloway," he said carefully, "do you have independent medical evidence or legal representation you wish to present before this court proceeds further?" For several seconds, nobody moved. Then I stood up slowly. Nathan turned toward me immediately, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I watched real fear enter my son's eyes. "I came prepared, Your Honor." The moment I said I came prepared, the entire courtroom shifted. Nathan's attorney stopped organizing papers. Lindsay straightened slightly in her chair, though I noticed the first crack in her composure. Nathan himself looked pale beneath the fluorescent courtroom lights, his jaw tightening as I placed my folder carefully on the table before me. For weeks they had treated me like a confused old woman, drifting helplessly through grief. Now they finally understood I had been watching everything. I began with the neurological evaluation, not the rushed examination performed by Dr. Howard Bellamy, but a complete independent assessment conducted privately through specialists in Atlanta. Cognitive testing, brain imaging, memory retention analysis. Every page confirmed the same conclusion: no dementia, no cognitive decline, no evidence whatsoever of impaired judgment, only symptoms consistent with prolonged chemical sedation. Judge Mercer read each document slowly, while the silence spread through the courtroom like pressure before a storm. Nathan's attorney attempted to object once, but Mercer silenced him immediately with a raised hand. Then I introduced the toxicology report. The benzodiazepine levels identified in the medication were strong enough to produce confusion, memory instability, emotional fatigue, and dependency over time. As I explained the findings, I felt something painful rising inside my chest, because for several weeks, I truly believed I might be losing my mind. I described waking each morning unable to trust my own memory. I described forgetting conversations and doubting simple thoughts that once would have come naturally to me. Losing confidence in yourself is a terrifying thing. It happens quietly, piece by piece, until your own instincts begin feeling unreliable. Nathan tried interrupting when I mentioned the medication schedule, but Mercer shut him down sharply before he finished speaking. The judge's attention shifted entirely after that. I continued calmly. Next came the financial evidence. I presented copies of forged digital property authorizations linked to my estate accounts. Then the preliminary escrow agreement involving the private New York buyer already preparing to purchase my mansion before any conservatorship ruling had even been approved. That revelation visibly rattled the courtroom. Mercer leaned forward while reviewing the documents more carefully. Nathan avoided looking at anyone now. Lindsay, however, finally lost control. She accused me of paranoia, manipulation, and emotional instability. Her voice rose too quickly, too emotionally, exposing desperation beneath the polished mask she had worn for months. I remained calm. Then I presented the life insurance policy, $3 million, purchased in my name weeks earlier. Primary beneficiary, Nathan Holloway. The silence afterward felt absolute. I looked toward my son then, and for one terrible moment, I saw shame flicker across his face before disappearing behind fear. But I was not finished. Using the hidden phone Amelia Brooks gave me, I had secretly photographed everything inside Lindsay's concealed safe. Forged signatures, offshore transfer paperwork, draft death certificate forms partially completed before my death had even occurred. As Mercer reviewed the photographs, his expression hardened visibly. The courtroom no longer felt like a family dispute. It felt criminal. Finally, the judge removed his glasses slowly and looked directly at Nathan and Lindsay. He announced a temporary recess and warned both legal teams that criminal referrals could follow depending on further evidence review. The hearing adjourned moments later. As people began standing around us, Nathan finally looked directly at me again. But the expression in his eyes no longer belonged to the little boy I once raised beside the Savannah River. And in that moment, I realized something equally painful. I no longer recognized him either. After Judge Mercer suspended the hearing, the Savannah courthouse transformed into something loud, chaotic, and hungry. Reporters appeared from nowhere, gathering near the marble staircases with cameras and phones raised toward every movement. Attorneys whispered urgently in corners while courthouse staff moved through the hallways carrying stacks of documents that suddenly carried criminal implications instead of civil ones. I remained seated alone inside the courtroom for several minutes after everyone else stepped outside. Strangely, victory did not feel satisfying. It felt exhausting. Across the room, Nathan's abandoned water glass still sat beside legal folders that only hours earlier were supposed to strip me of my life piece by piece. Looking at it made my chest ache in ways anger could not reach. Eventually, I walked into the hallway. That was when I heard them arguing. Nathan and Lindsay stood near a side corridor beside the elevators, both speaking in harsh whispers sharp enough to cut through the courthouse noise. Lindsay's polished image had cracked completely now. Her face looked pale with panic. Nathan blamed her for pushing everything too far. Lindsay accused him of weakness and stupidity for underestimating me. Listening to them felt like staring into the remains of a marriage built entirely on desperation and greed. Whatever affection once existed between them had already collapsed beneath fear. Amelia Brooks arrived shortly afterward, carrying a leather briefcase beneath one arm. The moment she reached me, I felt some of the pressure inside my chest ease slightly. She reviewed copies of the evidence carefully while we sat near the courthouse windows overlooking downtown Savannah. According to Amelia, Judge Mercer had already contacted state authorities privately regarding possible financial crimes tied to elder exploitation. Investigators were likely examining property transfers, insurance fraud, offshore banking activity, and digital forgeries before the day even ended. Then Amelia quietly told me something worse. Nathan's financial collapse was far deeper than I realized. His cryptocurrency investments had imploded nearly a year earlier. Private gambling debts followed afterward. Several personal loans remained unpaid, and disciplinary complaints against his law license were already under review by the Georgia Bar Association. I sat there stunned. All those months while Richard was dying from cancer, Nathan himself had apparently been drowning financially without ever telling us the truth. For one terrible moment, guilt settled over me heavier than anger. Had I ignored warning signs because I trusted him too much? Meanwhile, Lindsay paced the courthouse hallway, constantly checking her phone. She attempted several calls that visibly rattled her when nobody answered. The panic in her expression intensified whenever investigators walked nearby, discussing offshore account records. That detail mattered. She feared those accounts more than anything else. By late afternoon, 2 federal agents quietly entered the courthouse carrying identification folders. Nobody announced the Federal Bureau of Investigation openly, but Amelia recognized one of them immediately from prior financial crime task forces in Atlanta. The situation had escalated far beyond conservatorship fraud. Before leaving, I handed Amelia encrypted copies of every photograph and document I collected from Lindsay's hidden safe. She insisted I avoid staying alone for the next several days. Her warning unsettled me more than she intended. That night, I returned to the mansion alone beneath rolling coastal thunderclouds. The house felt colder than ever, as though betrayal itself still lingered inside the walls. Upstairs, something immediately caught my attention. The guest room door stood partially open. I knew I had locked it. Slowly, I stepped inside and approached the closet. The hidden safe behind the luggage sat wide open and completely empty. They knew someone had found the evidence. That night, after discovering the hidden safe emptied, I walked through the mansion with every light turned on. The house no longer felt familiar. It felt violated. Several drawers inside my office had been disturbed. Papers I intentionally left in specific positions sat slightly crooked now. Even the old laptop hidden in the attic beneath storage boxes had been moved less than an inch from where I remembered placing it. Nathan and Lindsay had returned before the courthouse hearing ended. They were searching for evidence. The realization settled heavily inside me, because desperate people rarely behave rationally once cornered. For the first time since this nightmare began, I understood I might no longer be safe inside my own home. I packed a small overnight bag before midnight and drove quietly through the rain-soaked Savannah streets toward Amelia Brooks's condominium overlooking the river. Amelia did not ask questions when she opened the door. She simply stepped aside and let me inside. The next morning, everything escalated again. 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived shortly after sunrise, alongside investigators from the Georgia Financial Crimes Division. Amelia remained beside me during the entire meeting, while I provided complete timelines, photographs, toxicology reports, banking evidence, and recordings connected to Nathan and Lindsay. The agents listened carefully without interruption. Then they revealed information far worse than I expected. Lindsay Carter was allegedly connected to a multi-state elder fraud network operating across Arizona, Florida, Nevada, and South Carolina. Elderly victims with significant assets had repeatedly lost homes, retirement funds, and investment accounts after becoming involved with carefully orchestrated romantic or family manipulation schemes. Some victims were declared mentally incompetent. Others died unexpectedly before investigations fully developed. As investigators described the cases, coldness spread through my chest. This was never simply about my mansion. The property sale connected directly to offshore laundering channels disguised through luxury real estate transactions, shell corporations, hidden escrow accounts, and foreign transfers formed a financial network much larger than anything Nathan likely understood when he became involved. And yet he still participated willingly. That truth remained impossible to escape. Throughout the afternoon, my phone continued vibrating with missed calls from Nathan. Voicemail after voicemail arrived filled with panic, apologies, and fragmented attempts to explain himself. I could not bring myself to listen to all of them completely. His voice sounded broken, but broken people can still destroy lives. Meanwhile, Lindsay had disappeared entirely after leaving the courthouse. Federal authorities suspected she might attempt to flee internationally using offshore financial contacts connected to the laundering operation. By evening, agents informed us airports and financial channels were already being monitored. Then came another painful revelation. Nathan had started cooperating partially with investigators. According to federal agents, he admitted Lindsay targeted him strategically during his financial collapse. She promised rescue from debt, coached him through legal manipulation tactics, and slowly normalized increasingly criminal behavior until fraud no longer felt shocking to him. Listening to that explanation tore something inside me. Part of my son had clearly been manipulated. But another part made conscious decisions every step forward. No amount of desperation erased that responsibility. Near dawn the following morning, one of the agents called Amelia with urgent news. Federal authorities had intercepted a major offshore transfer attempt only hours earlier, involving shell accounts tied directly to Lindsay's network. The operation was beginning to collapse. I stepped onto Amelia's balcony overlooking the Savannah River as sunlight slowly spread across the water beneath low gray clouds. For months, fear controlled every thought inside me. Now, standing there in the cool morning air, something stronger finally began replacing it. Resolve. By the time the federal criminal trial began, my story no longer belonged only to Savannah. National media stations parked satellite trucks outside the courthouse almost daily. Reporters discussed elder financial exploitation across every major network, while legal analysts dissected the expanding fraud investigation connected to Lindsay Carter and her associates. Some mornings, walking toward the courthouse felt surreal. People recognized me now, not as Vivian Holloway, retired federal investigator, but as the woman whose own son helped destroy her life. Lindsay had finally been captured 6 weeks earlier near a private airfield outside Miami while attempting to leave the country using false identification documents. Federal prosecutors later revealed evidence connecting her to shell corporations, hidden offshore transfers, and multiple coordinated schemes targeting wealthy elderly victims across several states. The courtroom remained packed throughout the trial. Nathan looked nothing like the confident attorney who once moved through Savannah's legal circles with polished charm. He appeared thinner, exhausted, and permanently hollowed by fear. Gray shadows lingered beneath his eyes each time he entered the courtroom wearing federal detention clothing instead of expensive tailored suits. Sometimes I caught him looking toward me briefly before lowering his eyes again. The evidence against both of them was overwhelming. Financial records, forged signatures, escrow transfers, insurance documents, conservatorship fraud planning, hidden offshore accounts connected to laundering operations disguised through luxury property sales. Listening to prosecutors describe the details publicly felt unbearable at times. Every document represented another layer of betrayal I had survived without fully understanding its scale while it happened. Nathan eventually testified against Lindsay as part of a cooperation agreement. Hearing my own son admit what they planned nearly broke something inside me. He confessed to forging signatures tied to my estate. He admitted helping manipulate competency narratives around my mental health. He acknowledged participating in the insurance fraud scheme after his financial collapse left him desperate and ashamed. While testifying, Nathan described Richard's death quietly, his voice cracking for the first time during the trial. He admitted that after losing his father, debt and panic consumed him completely. Lindsay entered his life during that weakness and slowly convinced him survival justified almost anything. Part of me hated hearing excuses. Another part saw traces of the frightened little boy I once raised. But neither grief nor manipulation erased responsibility. Lindsay remained cold throughout the proceedings. Even while prosecutors introduced additional victims connected to her network, she showed almost no visible remorse. Several elderly families testified about losing homes, retirement accounts, and dignity after encountering similar manipulation tactics. Judge Mercer condemned the exploitation sharply before sentencing. He described elder fraud as one of the cruelest forms of predatory crime because it weaponized trust, family, and vulnerability against people least able to defend themselves emotionally. The verdicts arrived quickly afterward. Lindsay was convicted on every major federal charge involving conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and coordinated exploitation schemes. Nathan was convicted as well, though prosecutors recommended reduced sentencing due to cooperation. Lindsay received life imprisonment alongside severe federal financial penalties. Nathan received 18 years in federal prison. Before officers escorted him away, he turned toward me one final time. Tears filled his eyes as he apologized softly for everything he destroyed. I wanted to feel anger. Instead, I felt grief too deep for anger anymore. I told him honestly that forgiveness did not exist inside me yet. Maybe someday it would, maybe not. Then they led him away in handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me immediately beneath the humid Savannah heat. I answered only once. Elderly people deserve dignity, protection, and respect. And silence is exactly what allows predators to survive. Several months after the trial ended, the mansion beside the Savannah River finally began feeling like my home again. The restoration happened slowly. I repainted rooms that once carried painful memories. I removed furniture connected too closely to betrayal and reopened spaces that had remained locked since Richard's death. Fresh coastal air drifted through the tall windows each morning while sunlight returned gradually to corners of the house that once felt permanently dark. For the first time in nearly a year, silence no longer frightened me. It comforted me. My life settled into quieter routines. Coffee on the veranda at sunrise, gardening near the old stone pathway Richard built decades earlier, long evenings reading beside the river while cargo ships moved slowly through Savannah Harbor beneath fading orange skies. The grief never disappeared completely. Neither did the damage. Some nights I still woke suddenly, remembering courtroom photographs, forged documents, or Nathan standing in handcuffs beneath federal officers' watchful eyes. A prison sentence does not erase motherhood. Part of me still mourned him the same way I mourned the child he used to be. But pain changed shape over time. It became something softer, heavier with reflection than rage. A few months after sentencing, I officially established the Holloway Foundation for Elder Justice using a portion of my restored financial assets. Former attorneys, retired investigators, and financial specialists volunteered to help elderly victims facing exploitation, conservatorship abuse, and financial manipulation. The response overwhelmed me. Letters arrived from across the country almost weekly. Some came from frightened seniors trapped inside controlling family situations. Others came from adult children who recognized warning signs before predators gained full control over aging parents. Many simply thanked me for speaking publicly. That mattered more than I expected. One quiet afternoon, I visited Richard's grave alone, carrying fresh white lilies from the garden. Savannah's autumn air had finally cooled, and oak leaves drifted slowly across the cemetery grounds while distant church bells echoed downtown. Standing there, I realized survival itself had become an act of defiance. Age did not make me weak, loneliness did not destroy me, and betrayal did not erase who I was. Predators rely on shame and silence because silence keeps victims isolated. The moment I trusted my instincts again, their control over me began collapsing. Now, each morning, I sit on the veranda watching sunlight spread slowly across the Savannah River while the city wakes beyond the water. I am older now, more scarred, more cautious, But I am no longer afraid because in the end, Nathan and Lindsay believed age had made me powerless. What they never understood was that wisdom becomes the one thing people like them can never steal. Sometimes the deepest wounds do not come from strangers, but from the people we once trusted without question. Yet even after betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, there is still strength waiting inside the human spirit. Time may leave scars, but wisdom teaches us how to survive them with dignity instead of bitterness. Growing older does not mean becoming powerless. In many ways, experience becomes the greatest protection of all. If this story touched you in any way, thank you for staying until the very end. Feel free to share your thoughts, experiences, or opinions in the comments below. Your voice may help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional family stories filled with life lessons, justice, and resilience, do not forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more stories like this.